This program is provided by Universal Genesis.
You've heard the term a million times, right? The Dark Ages. It just conjures up this image of, 1,000 years of grime and misery and just nothing. But have you ever stopped to ask, who actually came up with that? Who called it dark? Well, let's get into it, because the answer is probably not who you think it is.
I mean, think about the way we learn history in school. You get the epic story of Rome, all glory, senators and aqueducts. And then what? A giant 1,000-year question mark, a massive blank spot. Then all of a sudden, boom, the Renaissance shows up with incredible art and science. So what on earth was going on in that huge gap in between?
Seriously? Was it really just 1,000 years of nothing? Did humanity just hit this snooze button for a whole millennium? The whole idea that an entire civilization just sort of paused, that it stopped progressing, just feels way too simple, doesn't it? And that's exactly where our investigation is going to start. Okay, so we're going to approach this like a cold case. We're going to follow the evidence to figure out who actually invented this Dark Ages label. Because that's exactly what it is. It's a label. We're going to trace where this idea came from, and more importantly, who really benefited from telling this very specific story about the past.
And right away, we have our first huge clue. This is so important. The people who were actually alive back then, between the 5th and 15th centuries, they never, not once, thought they were living in a dark age. I mean, why would they? For them, it wasn't some historical age at all. It was just today. It was the present. The idea that they were stuck in some kind of historical ditch would have sounded completely insane to them.
So if they didn't call it that, who did? Well, this whole myth was built piece by piece over centuries. It actually started as poetry. In the 14th century, this guy Petrarch used darkness as a metaphor because he was bummed about all the lost Roman books. But the idea didn't really catch fire until the 18th century, the Enlightenment. See, thinkers like Voltaire wanted to call their own time the Age of Reason, and the best way to do that? Create a dark, spooky, superstitious opposite to define themselves against. The Middle Ages were the perfect candidate. After that, 19th century historians ran with it, and by the 20th century, it was just taught as a plain old fact in our textbooks. And this, right here, this says it all. This isn't some objective analysis of history, it's an argument. It's a sales pitch. For their time to be the light, the time before had to be the dark. It was brilliant marketing, really, for their whole intellectual brand. It's a classic move. Define yourself by everything you claim you're not.
So let's just call it what it is. The term Dark Ages isn't a neutral historical period like, say, the Bronze Age. No, it's an ideological slogan. It's a story that the modern era told about the past in order to feel good about itself. A story about progress and reason triumphing over what they painted as an ignorant, backwards time. Okay, but what if that whole story is just wrong? Was everything really lost? If you actually dig into the evidence, you find a totally different picture. Not a story of a 1,000-year break, but one of incredible continuity and, believe it or not, innovation. So let's make the case for continuity.
Far from being some dark, stagnant void, this period literally laid the foundations of our modern world. I mean, just look at this list. The very idea of a university, that was born in the Middle Ages. The complex banking and credit systems that run our global economy today, yep, they grew out of medieval trade networks. Even the concept of a parliament, a body that represents the people, that has its roots right here. This wasn't stagnation. This was the era that was busy building the software our world still runs on.
What's really interesting is how different places in Europe dealt with this period. For countries like France and Britain, the Middle Ages felt like a chapter that was officially closed. They'd had their revolutions or their reforms, and the past was, well, in the past. But for Germany, which was still this patchwork of little states, the past wasn't over. It was still very much alive. They couldn't just ignore it. They had to really wrestle with it, try to make sense of it. And they did that through philosophy.
And this is where this brilliant philosopher, Hegel, steps in and just completely flips the script. While everyone else was seeing this big, empty void, Hegel looked at the Middle Ages and saw something vital, something absolutely necessary. For him, you couldn't just skip this period to get to the good stuff. It was an essential part of the journey of how we became, well, us.
Hegel's big idea was that the Middle Ages were like the womb of the modern world. Think about a caterpillar in a chrysalis. From the outside, it looks like nothing is happening, right? It's just still. But inside, this incredible, complex transformation is taking place. That's what Hegel thought this period was. It was when humanity was quietly, inwardly, developing these really complex new ideas about individuality and conscience, the very ideas that the Age of Reason would later need to even exist. Without that chrysalis phase, the leap to modernity just doesn't make any sense. All right, now let's tackle the main event, the one thing that supposedly kicked off this whole darkness, the fall of the Roman Empire. Was it really the end of civilization as they knew it? Or was it something else entirely? Maybe a reorganization?
Let's think about this in terms of technology. The Western Roman Empire was like a giant, clunky, early operating system. It was incredibly expensive to run, super centralized, and it depended on constantly expanding to survive. It was brittle. Eventually, it just became totally unsustainable. The medieval kingdoms that came after were like a new OS, way more adaptive and resilient. It was a decentralized system, better suited for the technology and the local realities of the time.
So you see, the big shift away from the Roman way of doing things wasn't a failure. It wasn't a step backward at all. It was actually a completely logical and rational adaptation to new circumstances. The system was just evolving into something that could actually survive. It wasn't a bug. It was a feature. So after looking at all the evidence, what's our final verdict in the case of the so-called Dark Ages? Well, the verdict is that the labels we use for history are unbelievably powerful. And here is the absolute key takeaway. That label, Dark Ages, it isn't a window that helps us see into the past. It's a mirror, and it reflects the ambitions and the anxieties of the 18th century thinkers who made it popular. It tells us so much more about what they wanted to believe about themselves, that they were modern, that they were the light, than it does about the actual, complex, and often brilliant reality of the medieval world. And that, of course, brings us to a really important final question. The Enlightenment used the Dark Ages to tell a flattering story about itself. So what labels are we using right now to tell our own story? What stories are we telling about our own recent past to make ourselves feel enlightened or progressive? And the most important question of all, what and who are those labels leaving out in the dark?
This program is provided by Universal Genesis.